Good afternoon, everyone. What an energizing day it's been so far. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to this second afternoon session. Indeed, welcome formally to the 2025 annual meeting of the Bibliographical Society of America. I'm Kinohi Nishikawa, your president, if you didn't know that already. It's a sort of position I sort of hold with it's definitely a great honor, but it's also one that I like to sort of wear somewhat loosely because as I think today's proceedings have shown, really we are all in this together, and the many different skills and insights that we each bring to the table is what makes this organization great. Before we begin the proceedings of this afternoon, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the tremendous toll the hurricane in Florida and Appalachia and the wildfires in Southern California have had on our community over the past 6 months. On behalf of the Executive Committee, I extend our deepest sympathy to all those affected by these disasters, and especially to the students, scholars, dealers, librarians, and archivists who have lost so much in these tragedies. Let us continue the work of the BSA, mindful of the fact that the lives of books and manuscripts are intertwined with the lives and livelihoods of people, and that these things are linked by our care for the environment. The precarity or fragility of bibliographical pursuits is something our keynote speaker has thought and written extensively about. Ahmed El Shamsy is professor of Islamic thought and chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. El Shamsy earned his PhD from Harvard and is a leading scholar of the intellectual history of Islam, from the classical to the modern periods. He is the author of numerous articles, essays, chapters, and reference entries on Islamic intellectual history, and the range of his expertise is staggering, from papyrus to books, hair dyeing to poetry, theology to the law. El Shamsy's range is attributable not only to a boundless curiosity about how systems of knowledge are produced, but to an abiding commitment to bibliographical and book historical methods. Historical thought for him may be traced through careful study of Islamic material texts and a deep appreciation for how those texts had to be made and remade over time. Professor El Shamsy demonstrates this point brilliantly in two field-leading monographs. The Canonization of Islamic Law, A Social and Intellectual History, appeared from Cambridge University Press in 2013. In it, El Shamsy shows how the 8th and 9th century theologian and jurist Imam al-Shafi'i guided the codification of Islamic precepts through books, as distinct from the oral culture through which they had circulated. The stakes of this shift to a literate textualist jurisprudence was far-reaching, and it was subtended by political realignments that supported a centralized conception of the law. Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition, was published by Princeton University Press in 2020. Here, Professor El Shamsy tells the dramatic story of the moment Muslim book culture, particularly in Cairo, met movable type in the early 19th century. He shows how editors, librarians, collectors, and publishers constructed a tradition of classical Islamic literature through the emergent possibilities for documentation in and dissemination of print. The book moves between the contingency of personal selection and printing operation on the one hand, and the force of cultural heritage and civilizational discourse on the other, to reveal the human stories behind history-making events. So these descriptions might be reminiscent of work you've read by Walter Ong, Elizabeth Eisenstein, Robert Darnton, or David D. Hall. They no doubt have convinced you that Professor El Shamsy is very much of the BSA mold, whether you knew that or not. But his work also asks those of us more familiar with Western book culture to expand our frames of reference, bookish and otherwise, and see what we might learn from thick descriptions of Near Eastern knowledge production. Different key figures, different languages, overlapping and divergent temporalities. Professor El Shamsy's work will strike a chord with you and will challenge you at the same time. What better way to spend an afternoon than hearing him deliver the 2025 keynote lecture at the annual meeting? Ahmed El Shamsy.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I always feel slightly embarrassed to require somebody to introduce me. It sounds like a medieval king or something like this. You know, you need trumpets first, and then I can come into the room. But of course, you know, it's necessary because I couldn't have said these nice things about myself. So thank you all for coming and for introducing me to this society, which I knew of before, but knew much less about. And let me start. Let's see. Okay, that looks good. I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that the vast majority of people never think about the noble work of bibliography. I certainly had not, until I took up a part-time job as a cataloger of the Arabic books at Harvard's Widener Library in my first year of graduate school. That job gave me a behind-the-scenes perspective that has informed my outlook as an intellectual historian ever since. It showed me that books don't just exist as physical objects. They are also objects of knowledge. Their mere physical existence is almost irrelevant if one does not know of their existence, if one doesn't know of their existence or knows of it but cannot find them. Widener Library has an area called the Cage. It's not as dramatic as it sounds. No greased-up librarians in bare-knuckle fights. No, nothing like this. So the Cage holds books that are uncatalogued or undercatalogued. These books are in a state of limbo. They are physically present in the library, but for all practical purposes, they are absent, invisible to any readers consulting the catalog. So even one of the best and wealthiest modern research libraries has an underbelly of invisible books. How much more difficult, then, I asked myself, and how much more complex must it have been to find out about books in pre-modern societies? This is the point you should keep in mind as I introduce you to the focus of my presentation today. A bibliographer from 10th century Baghdad by the name of Ibn al-Nadim, who set himself to the task of compiling a catalogue of Arabic books. Ibn al-Nadim was not short of ambition, and it would be fair to say that he was confident to the point of overconfidence. Here's how he describes the scope of his book, entitled Fihrist, which simply means catalogue. He claims that this catalogue records all the books ever written by Arabs and all books ever translated into Arabic. He goes on to list more than 8,000 works, providing information about their authors, and often mentions where he has seen the work. This is a comprehensive inventory. This is, even though not fully comprehensive, but it is an inventory with the ambition of being comprehensive. That is really a remarkable monument to Arabic literary culture. In order to make Ibn al-Nadim's work intelligible, I will begin with a short outline of Arabic written culture from its origins in the Arabian Peninsula, through its spread eastwards and westwards, through the Arab conquests, up to Ibn al-Nadim's day in the booming private markets of Baghdad. I will introduce you to the sources of his bibliographical knowledge and the ordering principles that he applied in his work. I will then describe his effect on Western scholarship and show that scholars' over-reliance on him has transferred his blind spots and biases to us. But I must warn you that these are tentative conclusions only. There are more than 2 million Arabic manuscripts in libraries around the world, and hundreds of thousands of pre-modern inscriptions and graffiti, and only a fraction of this material has been edited, published, or studied so far. It's not easy to pinpoint the beginning of Arabic written culture. The first evidence of written Arabic appears in various forms of Old Arabic, such as Safaetic, centuries before Christ. Hundreds of thousands of these kinds of inscriptions have already been found in the Levant and northern Saudi Arabia, and more are constantly being discovered. Modern Arabic, that is, a form of the script that can be read and understood by speakers of Arabic today, is first attested in the 6th century of the Common Era. When Islam emerged in the early 7th century, it was centered on a book, a scripture, the Quran, written in Arabic. The earliest extant copies of the Quran that date from the 7th century were written on parchment. These copies must have been hugely expensive to produce. A Quran like this one here, we don't have it completely, but we have large fragments of it, many of them in private hand, would have required the skins of an estimated 150 to 200 sheep. Within the Arabian Peninsula, the vast majority of surviving examples of early Islamic writings are found on the cheapest and most widely available writing surface, rocks. This particular rock wall near Medina in today's Saudi Arabia contains examples of both genuine artistic expression in the form of poetry and the kind of content we would today associate with social media. Zooming in on one section of the wall, we find lines of poetry by the known poet Abu Adi. Next to it is a graffiti of the simplest kind. I am so-and-so. In this case, the writer identifies himself as Omar, son of Asim, who was the nephew of the poet Abu Adi. The next inscription is by a woman or girl named Zainab, daughter of Muslim, who declares her love for Omar, adding a defined note that I've loosely translated as whatever the haters may say. This single rock wall thus offers us a window on a highly localized community of authors making public statements to readers who probably knew the authors personally. At the same time, though, such graffiti also communicated with unknown future readers. We can see that writers were aware of this because they often dated their inscriptions with reference to an important event that had happened in that year. An important constraint on written culture in the early Islamic Arabian Peninsula was the shortage of written material other than rocks. Another material that was in use was bones, especially shoulder blades of camels and sheep. We have an account of a student in Mecca in the 8th century, attending classes in the central mosque, taking notes on bones. That's the kind of iPad 0.0. In class, and then going home and depositing the bones in a dedicated jar. But although bones served well for notes, we can still read what is written on these ones. They obviously did not lend themselves to long-form writing. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 632, the Muslim state, led by his successors, expanded rapidly from Arabia through conquest. Within 80 years, the Muslim armies had reached as far as southern France, in the west, beautiful Loire Valley, and in the east as far as India. These armies brought with them their own language and documentary conventions and applied them to the writing materials they encountered in the newly conquered territories. This, for example, is a document issued by the Muslim Arab Congress of Egypt in the year 642 of the Common Era, while moving through Upper, i.e. southern Egypt. It is written on papyrus, a material that is made by pressing plant fibers together, and that had been used in Egypt for millennia. It is written in 2 languages. The text on the top is written in Greek, which had been the official language of the previous regime, the Byzantine Empire, and the bottom text is in Arabic, the language of the conquerors. And this is doubling the same text produced twice. The document is a receipt for sheep that the Arab troops had requisitioned from the local population, and its purpose, its explicit purpose, was to provide an official record so that when the annual taxes were due, the value of the sheep would be deducted from the community's taxes. The newly available medium of papyrus was also used for non-governmental purposes, such as these study notes written by an aspiring Muslim scholar. And of course, it made possible longer form writing. In antiquity, the dominant form of book writing around the Mediterranean was the scroll. And we do have a few examples of Arabic papyrus scrolls, such as this scroll of prophetic sayings written in the 8th century. This is only a piece of it. It says 1 meters 89, I don't know how many, so it's 6 foot, more than 6 foot long. However, starting with the first copies of the Quran in the 7th century, the paradigmatic form of the Arabic book was the codex. We have fragments of papyrus codices, such as this one from a book on law written in the 8th century Medina by Malik ibn Anas. However, papyrus is not a very good material for codices. Its edges fray easily, and it never became widespread beyond Egypt in the surrounding areas. But sometimes in the 8th century, Muslims in Central Asia encountered a revolutionary new medium for writing, paper. The image on the right is a watercolor painting illustrating the process of making paper, and the image on the left is of the very same process being undertaken by some of my undergraduate students in my backyard last fall. Paper became ubiquitous in Muslim lands because the Caliphate, now based in Baghdad, Iraq, adopted paper as its preferred medium of communication and archiving. The primary advantage that the caliphal bureaucracy reportedly saw in paper was that it was more resistant to tampering than parchment is. If you scratch out written text on parchment and rewrite it, that's possible. But with paper, you tear the paper, so it's more tamper-proof. Paper was also easy to produce, easy and relatively cheap to produce. All you needed was an ample supply of simple fibers, such as rags. Subsequently, paper mills were established in Iraq and elsewhere, and the wide availability and affordability of paper fueled a veritable literary explosion. Stationery shops selling paper, ink, and pens popped up across the Muslim world, and these stationers then became de facto bookshops. Baghdad was the first Muslim city to boast a dedicated stationery market with reportedly 200 such shops. The literary boom made possible by this cheap writing material enabled the emergence of new genres of literature, the practice of private reading, and a culture of bibliophilia. To illustrate this culture, let me quote a passage from a love letter to books composed by the 9th century Iraqi prose master al-Jahid, who called the book, I quote, "a receptacle of knowledge, a container crammed with good sense, a vessel full of jesting and earnestness. It will amuse you with anecdotes, inform you on all matters of astonishing marvels, entertain you with jokes, or move you with homilies, just as you please. You are free to find in it an entertaining advisor or an encouraging critic. Have you ever seen a garden that will fit into a man's sleeve? An orchard you can put on your lap? Or a speaker who can speak of the dead and yet be the interpreter of the living? Where else will you find a companion who sleeps only when you are asleep and speaks only when you wish him to?" In order to quench his thirst for books, al-Jahid reportedly rented bookshops for the night in order to browse and read the books they contained. One morning, he was found dead under a collapsed bookshelf, in effect, becoming the paradigmatic martyr of book love in the Arabic tradition. By the way, if you wonder why he looks rather ugly on that stamp, it's because Jahid is actually his nickname, which was Popeye. So that was just, he was known to have that. We also find evidence of the role that booksellers played in literary production. One of the most prolific pre-modern Muslim authors, At-Tabari, reports that when he started to write a book on a particular topic, he would first commission a bookseller he knew with the job of gathering all available previously published works on that topic, and then use them as the basis of his own work. So it's, in a way, it's a kind of librarian just on the private market kind of relationship. The image here shows the title page of his History of Prophets and Kings, which in many ways is the most important history of early Islam. The proliferation of Arabic books led to a need for an inventory of what was available. In other words, a bibliography. The earliest work we know of that was called a catalogue of books was written by a man called Ibn al-Kufi in the early 10th century, and it appears to have been a catalogue of his own private library. We know of this book only because it is cited extensively by the primary object of my talk today, the Baghdadi bookseller Ibn al-Nadim, in his own work, likewise called the Catalogue or Fihrist. Ibn al-Nadim is a relatively obscure figure who left few traces in the historic record apart from the book he authored. We knew that he was a bookseller and that he and his family had contacts in courtly circles. His work survives in about half a dozen manuscripts, the most significant of which is shown here. The first half is kept at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, and the second half at the Shahid Ali Pasha collection of the Sulaimaniya Library in Istanbul. And here on the right-hand side, this is the most modern edition in 4 volumes. This earliest manuscript it's not an autograph, i.e. it's not in the handwriting of Ibn Nadim himself, but it is a copy made from the autograph within a few years of the book's completion. Importantly about this manuscript is that it reproduces the autograph precisely, including the lacunae in the text, and it thus tells us about the way in which Ibn Nadim gathered information. I will return to this in a moment. As I noted earlier, Ibn al-Nadim's catalogue is remarkably ambitious, claiming to provide a comprehensive catalogue of all known books in his time. As you can see from the table of content, the more than 8,000 titles he lists cover a wide spectrum of topics from religious, linguistics, and natural sciences to literature, poetry, law, and practical topics such as cookbooks. So, as I said, religious, linguistic, natural sciences, poetry, law, cookbooks, and all manners of entertainment literature such as The 1001 Nights. A significant portion of the Fihrist is devoted to translations into Arabic. The translations of works of Greek philosophy and medicines are relatively well known in the West because in the later Middle Ages, many of these works were reintroduced to Western Europe through translations from Arabic into Latin. But translations of works written in Middle Persian and Sanskrit were no less significant. An example of this translation is Patanjali's work on yogic philosophy by a person we might call history's first Indologist, al-Biruni, who was a contemporary of Ibn al-Nadim. So he was a Muslim scholar who had studied Sanskrit and both translated Sanskrit works into Arabic and wrote his great book on India in which he talked about Indian philosophy, Indian religious thought, etc. What even a cursory glance at the Fihrist's contents shows us is that by the 10th century, Arab readers were immersed in a remarkably globalized book culture mediated through the lingua franca of Arabic. But this unified Arabic book culture that both produced new books and translated existing books at a frenzied rate was unfolding at a time when the unified Islamic empire had fragmented. In the late 10th century, the caliph still reigned in Baghdad. Here. But another caliph held sway in Cairo, here. And there was another one in Cordoba, over here. Further, the caliph in Baghdad, his power was largely ceremonial. Real authority in the areas nominally ruled by him belonged to a series of military dynasties. But this loss of political unity did not hamper the development of book culture. In fact, the emergence of imperial cities and courts outside Baghdad offered increased opportunities of patronage to the mobile classes of writers and scholars. In return, the burgeoning Arabic book culture strengthened connections across the Islamic empire's former territories. Biographical dictionaries about the scholars and poets of Spain were read in Central Asia, and vice versa. Ibn al-Nadim's contemporary, the Palestinian geographer al-Muqaddasi, wrote a de facto travel guide to the Muslim world that contained not only detailed descriptions of the sites to visit, but also very practical guidance, such as where to stay, what to eat, and how to avoid overpaying for things. Long-distance travel was a relatively common activity, and works such as al-Muqaddasi's catered to this market. Long-distance travel and trade also promoted the spread of books. It is against this backdrop of political fragmentation and the simultaneous expansion of book culture that Ibn al-Nadim, living in the formerly undisputed center of power and scholarship, set out to write his all-encompassing catalogue of Arabic books. Now there's the content. Table of contents. Okay. Okay. Now I know where I am. The grandness of Ibn al-Nadim's ambition is reflected in the introduction to the Fihrist, in which he muses on a wide range of topics. He begins by celebrating writing in itself, books, and by quoting poetry in praise of books, copyists, and good handwriting. He then gives a historical sketch of the development of writing among the Arabs. Basically, what I gave you a moment ago, but with some more details and with some kind of very particular interests. So he was a bookseller, so he was very interested in types of paper. Where can you get these kind of types? What are the sizes of these types? In different types of fonts. This font is used by government bureaucrats. This font is used by calligraphers who write the Quran and other things. Then he discussed the development of different, oh, okay, I already said this. He names the most famous calligraphers of his time, the most famous bookbinders of his time, and the most famous illuminators. So he's very much part and parcel of that culture. Then he talks about ancient Arabic scripts, particularly Himyaritic, a language and script from ancient Yemen, and he reproduces an example of Himyaritic from a text held in the Caliphal library. So obviously he copies a text. This is a copy from the copy that he made, so it's not 100% correct, but you can see the parallel, right, when you see an actual Himyaritic inscription. Then he moves to a discussion of the other written languages with which he is familiar, starting with Persian, the language of the Sasanian Empire, which the Arabs conquered. Ibn Nadim lived in the period in which Persian, now written in Arabic script, right? Not to forget, I mean, Persian is an Indo-European language, but it's now written in Arabic script, re-emerged as a great literary language. In fact, as Ibn Nadim was compiling his catalog, Firdausi was writing the great Persian epic, the Shahnameh. If you're familiar with Persian miniature painting, that is the great, that's the most famous book of classical, Persian anyway. And this was written, during his lifetime. Ibn Nadim also talks about Hebrew and Greek, even giving the names of the letters in the Greek alphabet. He stresses the long written history of these languages and recalls the names of the figures credited with inventing or introducing their scripts. He continues with Latin, Chinese, Sogdian, Sanskrit, and what he calls Frankish, noting that the latter language uses the same script as Latin, and that one encounters this script on, what are the products that you encounter Frankish script on? Frankish swords that you find in the market. And that once a Frankish king had sent a letter to the caliph in that language to propose a marriage alliance. He also mentions what he calls Russian, by which he means the language spoken by the Vikings who traveled along and settled on the Volga, and describe the runes in which they write. And he mentions Armenian and its Cyrillic script, observing that even though at first sight the Armenian script resembles Latin, is in fact distinct from it. Then he turns to sub-Saharan Africa. He lists the names of several ethnic groups in the region, and then quotes Al-Jahith, remember the book guy who got squashed, who was himself of East African heritage, saying that East Africans, quote, have rhetoric and eloquence, but no indigenous writing. Now, Ibn Nadim objects to this claim, pointing out that Ethiopian is in fact a written language. He describes the script as being close to the South Yemeni script he presented earlier in the book, which is in fact correct. Only after his exhaustive survey does Ibn Nadim launch into the actual listing of the books. This is a picture of a library. You note that books are put on top of each other, they're not put next to each other. I was very happy when I saw this the first time because that's my natural inclination of how to put books in order. So after he has finished this introduction, Ibn Nadim launches in the actual listing of books. But I don't think that the grand sweep of the introduction is merely rhetorical here. Instead, by first taking the reader on a tour of all other known literary languages, he seeks to present Arabic as the inheritor of and rightful heir to all of these traditions. The three major sources that Ibn Nadim reports having drawn on to compile his bibliography are, one, his personal knowledge of the book market as a professional bookseller, two, his access to the libraries of various members of the elite, and three, citations of and references to books in other books. In addition, in the area of non-Muslim religious literature, where he, as in the religious literature of non-Muslims, that's what I mean, where he admits being out of his depth, he acknowledges the help of informants. For his information about Jewish literature, he says he consulted, quote, a prominent man from among the Jews. He lists, as always, chronologically, the Torah, the Mishnah, and then works of Saadia Gaon, who had died, a mere 40 years earlier, arguably the most important rabbinic thinker before Maimonides, who wrote in Judeo-Arabic, that is, Arabic in Hebrew script. As an aside, he mentions that there are still Jews around where he lives that met Saadia in person. Meanwhile, to gain information on Christian literature, he says he asked Jonas the priest and visited the Greek quarter of Baghdad. Now, here we get to an actual structure of an entry. So this is, as I said, this is from the oldest manuscript. And you can see that the basic structure is this. There is what he calls books. Like in English and Arabic, this word bab can both mean the whole thing and a big subsection. So this book, the catalog, has 10 books of 10 big topics. This is on grammarians, and there's chapter 3 of this, of grammarians who combine these two regional schools that are very important in Arabic grammar. Then here is the name of the author, Ibn Qutayba. That's the name by which he's known. Then the entire name, including his genealogy, biographical, kind of a biographical sketch. And then he starts with the titles. So here, this is the first line, Kitab, the book of, and it's written in this kind of visually clear form. So this is like this is one entry, so you can see Kitab. So the book of, the book on topics of poetry, and then here you can see these are the names of subsections, so the major subsections of this book. So he's not just listing titles, but he's also listing what these books contains. Obviously, super useful. If we have a manuscript today, sometimes we find like, oh, there's actually something missing because we know that the book that he had actually had more content. What is really interesting for us is that there are lacunae. So this allows us to think about the way in which he wrote this book. It's funny that there's 3 screens here, because if I look a bit further, then people look somewhere else. Like, is there something more interesting happening outside? But I understand. I apologize that my laser only goes to the middle. I should really kind of like shoot around. But so there's an entry here on the man called, so in the middle here, Ibn Zanji. From the name, you can see that he was of East African slave descent. Right? Zanj, that's sub-Saharan Africans from East Africa. So he was an author, but yeah, Ibn Zanji, the author, he is, and then nothing. And his books are nothing. But there's an empty space, so I assume he left that space open for when he gets that information. We can see this in other entries. Here we have this man, Ibn Jinni. He has some information, a little bit, just like his family names. He knows about one of his books, but he kind of leaves space. Clearly he knows that there's more to come, but he doesn't have the information. But then a later hand adds this. So it's almost, he's calling, either he leaves space for himself or for later people to fill in this information, and somebody has filled in more information. Another example that I'm giving here on the side is where he's not sure about the information he has. Like, is this person, what exactly is this the name of this guy? So he says, I'm not sure, I'll try to look into it and I'll get back to it. And then, as these things always happen, you don't get back to it. But it's a way of seeing him at work. Yeah. Okay. There's a dark side. All right, so that's not the dark side yet. We can, by looking at the surviving manuscripts, I'm only showing an example here from the oldest one. We can see that this book was used by scholars after him. And one of the ways in which the pre-modern book was used that maybe today we as librarians wouldn't be happy with is that people wrote like who owns this, like even on library books, they wrote like, oh, I wrote this on this and this day, which obviously for historians is very interesting. So one of the, like probably the greatest Egyptian historian, al-Maqrizi, writes his ownership note on the margin. So he owned this for a while. And by looking at all of these manuscripts, we see, oh, by the way, here, haha. You see this here? This strange script is much later. That was done 1801, this script. And when I came here, my taxi drove past the Victoria's Secret's store. You wouldn't have thought that I'd make a connection to Victoria's Secret, would you? And there was a big picture of a woman called Gigi Hadid. Yeah? She is the descendant of the guy who endowed this. I swear, I'm not joking. This guy, he was also called Ahmed El-Shamsy. He was the Ottoman governor of Palestine. And he endowed a library in Acre. I participated with a group of international scholars. We found the library catalog. I mean, by the time, like, this Ahmed El-Shamsy he was a badass. He defeated Napoleon, one of the few people who defeated Napoleon in battle, when Napoleon invaded Egypt and then the Levant. But that library that he established, most of it was sold, kind of in the early 20th century particularly. So much of it is spread, including this manuscript, right, that is now in the Chester Beatty Library. We know who took it from there and sold it to Dublin, but anyway, it's a longer story. But we can see the afterlives. We can see that people kept using this work as a reference work of what happened in these early centuries. There's another afterlife, of course, people trying to update or write this anew. This is a 17th century Ottoman scholar, Katib Çelebi, who tried to write an updated list. This is actually his autograph, so you can see he wrote this over 20 years. He only got less than a third into it. It's really entertaining to look at this manuscript and see all the additions and strike-throughs and corrections, etc. So you can really see a cataloger at work. So there's a continuing bibliographical tradition there. And then, print comes very late to the Muslim world. If you're more interested into this, you could always buy my book. It's a suggestion, you don't have to do it. It's very nicely produced, but never mind. Also, much cheaper than stuff that I published with Cambridge. It's really like under $30, so just mentioning it. So this edition was done by an Orientalist in Gustav Flügel in 1871. And after its publication, it became the dominant lens through which Western Orientalists perceived the early Arabic book culture, like the one lens. It became their primary guide and map to this literary tradition, to the point that Orientalists literally traveled to Muslim country with it as a shopping list to either buy or, shall we say, otherwise acquire? Is that the... Is that the way that you guys can sleep at night? That's the way we put it. Arabic manuscripts used at the time. They were actively looking for the works listed by Ibn al-Nadim. The manuscripts they acquired were then edited and printed in the great centers of Orientalist publishing, such as Leiden in the Netherlands and Leipzig in Germany in the later 19th and early 20th century. Here's one example. So this is a scholar who saw the text mentioned in Ibn Nadim and then went to manuscript libraries to look for it. He found it and then he published it. Thanks to the additional features of the catalog that I've described, its framing, its biographical information, and historical treatment, Orientalists celebrated Ibn Nadim's work as not just a mere catalog, but as a work of Literaturgeschichte, history of the literature, of Arabic literature, up until this point. Now, the kind of classical Orientalist fashion, the compliment was kind of backhanded. Here's the German Orientalist Johann Voeck scoffing that Ibn Nadim's achievement is remarkable, especially since Muslim culture is generally so totally devoid of real appreciation of books. One of my students saw this and said, "Fuck you, Johann." Which is funny. The flip side of Western scholars' long obsession with Ibn Nadim's Fihrist as the definitive bibliography of the first 3 centuries of Arabic book culture is the widespread neglect of the books that Ibn Nadim did not include in his catalog. And what is actually interesting is that now with digital tools, we have digital databases of all the books that survive from the early period, and we actually see that the majority are not in his catalog. Even of those that survive. Of course, I mean, the majority have been lost, but even of those that survive, the majority are not in his catalog. So, sorry, Ibn Nadim. It's nice to have, to start with a high ambition, but not everything is included here. What has rarely been recognized in the voluminous literature that has grown around Ibn Nadim is that his approach was marred by certain systematic blind spots, and that these led him to exclude entire genres of books. His table of contents certainly does not betray any such gaps. It runs the gamut from religious to secular writings, from high culture to sex manuals, via every conceivable topic. But there are certain types of books that were in existence and circulated in Baghdad in Ibn Nadim's lifetime, but that are not mentioned in the Fihrist and are kind of systematically not present. This is because they circulated in forms unfamiliar to Ibn Nadim. This form of circulation is commonly called oral transmission, A-U-R-A-L. The books that were transmitted orally were generally ones that held significant historical and cultural values, such as books recording sayings by and stories about the Prophet Muhammad, for example, and the early Muslim community. To access such a book in 10th century Baghdad, you would not go to a bookstore or to a library. You would find a living transmitter of the book and hear it directly from that transmitter in person. The transmitter would be either the book's author or someone who received the book orally from its author, or someone who received it orally from someone who received it from the author, or someone who received it from someone who received it from someone who, you get the idea. This was the way in which certain books were passed on, and in fact, the practice continues until today. This is a Tunisian scholar called Farid al-Baji. You can visit him today to study the Muwatta of the 8th century scholar Malik ibn Anas, a book that offers directions for how to pray, fast, perform the pilgrimage, bury the dead, and many other things in the form of carefully selected and vetted statements of the Prophet Muhammad. For each statement, Malik, the author, names the person from whom he heard it, the person from whom that person had heard it, then the person from whom that person had heard it, and so on, all the way to the Prophet himself. The shortest such chain of intermediaries between Malik and Muhammad consists of 3 transmitters, but most chains contain between 5 or more. In turn, al-Baji, today, alive today, has a record of every one of the 26 individuals in the chain that links him to the book of Malik. And if you study the Muwatta with him, you get added to this chain, with your name becoming the 28th after Malik's name and the 31st to 33rd after the Prophet's. Al-Baji is by no means unusual. Although this work, the Muwatta, is now available in multiple printed editions and translations, many people around the world continue to participate in this form of personal celebration of book culture and textual continuity. In fact, there was one public reading session of another text that still retains an unbroken chain of transmission in Chicago not a long time ago. In many cases, books that were transmitted orally in this way, rather than encased in the physical form of the codex, remained invisible to Ibn al-Nadim. His world was that of the book market and of private, usually elite readers and collectors. But books such as the Muwatta existed largely outside of this space. They were not bought or sold on the market, and the audiences they attracted were often made up of ordinary people, including illiterate ones, who would flock to the public reading sessions at which books such as these were read aloud. By being present in such a session and having their presence documented, anyone could join the chain of a book's transmission without spending a penny or even knowing how to read. What makes the practice of oral transmission so interesting to a historian of the book is that in order to maintain these chains of transmission, an enormous amount of data about those who listened to a book's reading and therefore gained the right to transmit it has been amassed over the centuries. This data offers us this is one of the efforts to kind of systematically collect this. This is a database housed at the University of Hamburg by Konrad Hirschler and Said al-Jumani that brings these notes together, this information that was collected over the centuries. This data offers us a window on the identities of readers in different times and places. And digital humanities projects such as this one have begun to gather this material systematically. To give you an example, this diagram records the surviving chains of transmission for a particular version of Malik's Muwatta that was brought to Iraq by one of his students. This diagram, which you don't have to read, it's too small for anyone to read, lists all the people who heard or read this version of the book, but it reflects, so it's not comprehensive, but it reflects the information that my students and I were able to find in the course of a seminar I taught last year. The name that I circled in green is that of a famous Baghdadi transmitter of religious works, a woman called Shuhda. Shuhda was the daughter of a religious scholar who took her education very seriously. She heard/read numerous books and received official authorization to transmit them onwards, and she was also a sought-after copyist of books thanks to her excellent calligraphy. She was authorized to transmit so many books that she was considered something of a one-stop shop for anyone who wanted to access religious books in 12th century Baghdad. One of her students compiled a list of the texts she could transmit, and the list runs to 140 pages in the printed version. This too is a catalog of books, but its contents have very little overlap with those of Ibn al-Nadim's catalog. The books transmitted by Shuhda were primarily collections of prophetic sayings, such as the Muwatta, and in fact they include all the most important such works. Shuhda came from a family of scholars, but we also encounter elite women from politically powerful households participate in public readings. This is a record of a public reading in which the granddaughter of Saladin, right? Sultan Saladin transmitted a text in the year 1275. I do not claim for a minute that women are represented equally with men among the readers and transmitters in the data we have, but they do have a significant presence. Their visible role in oral transmission contrasts with the evidence we have of the world of private reading, where there are vanishing few references to women. The world represented in Ibn Nadim's Fihrist is populated almost exclusively by men, specifically literate elite men. By contrast, the evidence indicates that the world of oral, so what this example here shows, this is in Ibn Nadim's catalog, this is the only mentioning of females, and this is female poets. And you can see there's very, very few names. So this is Ulayya, for example, a poetess, that's her name, and then it says 20 pages. Okay, not very much. Zarzar, again, about 20 pages. This lady here, he says muqilla, so even just a little bit, a small amount has only survived from it. So there is very little indication of female participation in the literary world that Ibn Nadim represents. By contrast, the evidence indicates that the world of oral transmission accommodated people of all walks of life: craftsmen, housewives, children, slaves, those who were educated and those who were not. This is an example of a large-scale public reading in which 765 attendees were registered. So this is the manuscript. This is it written out, so you can look for it. And this took place in Damascus. It's held in Berlin these days, but it had 765 people attending. And sometimes we know these people, sometimes we don't, but we can see from the name where they came from. Sometimes it said what their job was. So this is a very rich resource also for social history. But apart from these public readings, we also have evidence of domestic reading. Here's an example of a domestic reading, an oral transmission session that involved not just various members of a family, uncle, wife, daughters, and a son, but also the family's household slave, who was the one recording the session. So this man here is called Lu'lu', which literally means pearl. Where's his name? We know from other similar notes. So anyway, so this Lu'lu', he was probably a prisoner of war from this is the back end of the Crusades. He was Anatolian. We know that from the information that's given. But you can see he was the one who wrote this text in Arabic. So he was clearly literate. Not the best handwriting, but compared with other handwritings, it's actually readable. We know from other similar notes that this slave, Lu'lu', also participated in other audition sessions together with his wife, who's also noted in them. And it seems that their son actually became a recognized jurist and author of a legal treatise in Cairo. And the way you can see this is because people are normally mentioned as their name and then son of so-and-so. And so we have a guy, again, his name is Ahmed. I'm sorry, this is not self-centered. All the important people in this presentation are called Ahmed, but yes. So somebody who moved from a status of prisoner of war and enslavedness to a significant position in the literary world of his time. To conclude, my God, has it already been 5 hours? No. Medieval audiences encountered Arabo-Islamic written culture in a variety of forms. The adoption of paper provided an already literate culture with an affordable and durable medium for long-form writing. Readers encountered books for sale in the market and in the developing institutions of the library, and the literate and the illiterate alike could participate in the public dissemination of literature that connected them to the fountains of Islam. Ibn Nadim's work captures much, but not all of this variety. On the one hand, it offers a fascinating window on what we can legitimately call a globalized book culture, a post-imperial cultural space with a dominant literary language that bordered and had absorbed literatures from Central Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Europe. But on the other hand, Ibn Nadim's grand claim of comprehensiveness has been accepted too easily, especially in 19th and 20th century Orientalist scholarship, which embraced the Fihrist as its primary guide to Arabic writing and consequently for a long time reflected its limitations and biases. In a context in which countless pre-modern Arabic books still haven't been edited or studied, it is essential that we reject these blinders and recognize the full range of written expression that Arabic book culture has produced. Thank you.
Inside the actor's studio time. Wow. Remarkable. A historical survey of Arabic writing and creative expression from inscription to books, and which will be new to most of us, but also a very pointed argument about knowledge production and the limitations of even your field's knowledge of the past based on a highly selective account of what was decided to be passed on. I really love the way you helped us appreciate the importance of thinking about these lines of transmission by emphasizing the sort of textual authority that we grant to the catalog, whether we know it or not. Can you talk a little bit more about the evidence you drew from to reconstruct some of those lines of transmission? Because they seem to lie beyond, right, the bookseller's frame of reference. They're not the sort of elite documentary codices that the catalog seems to fetishize and that subsequent historians and scholars have done as well. So where can we find, or where do you find those really high quality pieces of evidence where we essentially start to value people who are documenting, witnessing performances of literary transmission? Because that seems to me to be data that we don't value enough. You know, in the Western world, we often say liveness is something you cannot capture. It is ephemeral, it is here and then gone, and you just have to live with that. Well, here, the orality of it seems to want to acknowledge that, but also say there's still data about these performances that can be transmitted. Where do you find that data?
So, first of all, this there is this phenomenon that, as you can imagine, you cannot. Not all of these living textual traditions can be kept alive forever, because there's always new ones being added, and people don't want to spend their entire life just transmitting stuff. So there's some books where you can say, okay, this textual traditions was alive until. So this one manuscript I studied with my students, it was alive until 1402, and afterwards it became a book in a library, and basically. We were like the first people who looked at it again since 1402. But what is interesting is that either these records of reading, so what I showed you, for example, this fascinating one in this private house of this scholar in Cairo, where he says, like where the slave is recording who's attending this reading. This attendance note is attached to the end of the manuscript. So then you have generations of reading notes. Like every time it was read, somebody added a note of who was present and from where that came. So you inherited this copy, and then it moved through time and was reactualized and then people who read it with the person, then they made their own copy that lived with them. And so there is a lot of material. There are some libraries that you can see, everyone has their own agenda for collecting works, what is important, what is not important. If you're just interested, like if you take Ibn al-Nadim's work, very often, you end up with a library that is poor in this. But there are libraries, for example, the National Library in Damascus is very rich. It's probably the richest single source for this. There is the history of Damascus, which is a 70-volume work that was written in the 12th century. 70-volume work that was then read out. The whole work was written out in the central mosque in Damascus, and we have the attendance record of who attended this. And then there's fascinating stories. You can look at what the jobs were of the people who did this. There's one of my students, Garrett Davidson, he wrote a fascinating article. So one of the features of this living tradition is that the best chain of transmission is the shortest. You can imagine, right? You want to have the shortest way. How can you get the shortest way all the way to the Prophet Muhammad, for example? And there was this ancient woodcutter who lived in Damascus. And there were some young students in the 14th century who thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if this guy had at some point heard books, then that we would have such a short connection. And they checked the records, and in fact his name was there. So then people are like, well, he's old and he's a woodcutter. So they interviewed him. So as a child, he attended these readings in the mosque, and he says, yeah, I do remember I was attending these sessions, and then afterwards I went swimming with my friends. That was like the extent of his memories. And then people were like, yeah, that's it. And then he became like a celebrity. He was shipped all over the Muslim world to attend these readings, so people had a short chain of connection. So it was him and a very old woman who were like this old couple who were just traveling from place to place. So that there's a lot of history to be told, which is it's really only coming out now, both with the kind of turning away from an exclusively elitist scholarship of literature. Also a movement towards material history, reception history. So it's not just about, you take this book and say, well, classical Orientalist scholarship is very philological, textual, critical in the sense of how do we get the earliest version of this text? How do we eradicate spelling mistakes? But rather saying, no, we want a philology that actually shows this text moving in history and its reception and what it did at this specific time and this specific community. That is something that has been really done only very recently.
We can see the fruits of such a work when you're able to trace it to Gigi Hadid. I mean, but in many ways, when you came in by taxi and saw that, it immediately, sort of hit you that this was a connection that you certainly hadn't planned on making, but it's right there, and this is your method. So you're able to see that transmission throughout time. What I love about that response is that Ahmed is asking us to pay attention to those paratexts, to the wastes, to the things we don't necessarily value in our books as hallmarks of transmission and evidence of how these objects move through time. Could you talk a little bit about the digital component you relied on in the presentation and what efforts your German colleagues or you in combination with them are doing to recover some of these chains of transmission?
So I spoke in my presentation primarily about Orientalist scholarship and in publishing works. What my second book is primarily about is the efforts by indigenous Arab-speaking scholars in editing and publishing books, and the differences and overlaps with Orientalist scholarship and the kind of clashes over method and over authority and objectivity, etc., that came out of this. And in the last, shall we say, in the last 25 years, in the Muslim world, there have been all these projects to digitize texts. Very often, like these, like you can go to a bookshop and find really old text, like 1,200-year-old texts that are just sold, and they are always in print. My European colleagues like, oh wait, did you get this? Print, like bookshop, Amazon basically, and now they're being digitized, and they're copyright is not such a big deal. There's a lot of this stuff is just available. I barely go to the library anymore because most of the text I study you can just download as PDFs, but also digital databases and better cataloging that's being done that really allows you also to draw on the paratexts, and you can see, then you can suddenly trace things that you needed a lifetime of experience before. Now you can just do it within, so things are coming together. There's a more of a sense of materiality, but also the digital direction makes it easier for people to do and to appreciate. So that there are these, I don't know, more recent editions also add the paratexts to print, because there is more of an interest to this, and printing techniques also allow you to do this. And so in that sense, there are interests from all directions in this, and people are recataloguing collections that were cataloged maybe in the 19th century, and so now in the 5th generation, and they find more and more texts. You have, I'm involved in the whole question of fragments in libraries. There's so many fragments. If you have, one of the advantages of paper is that it's cheap and whatever, but one of the disadvantages is that parchment is much more stable material, and so we have very few very old paper books. The ones that survive are the copies of copies, or like whatever. There's like certain 2-3 generations is the norm, at least for these older works. But there are a lot of fragments to be still found that are not in fact catalogued. So all of this is there's still a lot of kind of basic research to be done and basic work to be done. Of course, these days, digital humanities does this sometimes. There are certain, there's several projects to digitize manuscripts. There was one when the Yemen civil war started, an initiative to kind of rescue them basically digitally. There are several projects going on at the same time. So it's even difficult to just keep track of all the different ones. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Aaron will come to you so you can have the floor.
Thank you for just a spectacular talk. My brain is bursting, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this room. So I'll try to keep it to 2 or 3 questions related. What you call oral, or we might call oral transmission, I'm not sure how different it is. Did it rely on any of the structures that we know were true for the Homeric epics and Hungarian tales and so forth, where formulaic? Was there a formulaic aspect that provided an aid to memory of those who spoke out loud to the listeners? Number one. Number two, when you were very clever to wait till nearly the end of your talk to bring in the point about cultural transmission. You said many states, one book culture. And you mentioned, and I kept waiting to hear the word copyists, and I kept waiting, and I heard it once, and I kept waiting to hear, calligraphers. I heard that once or twice. So what I'm trying to understand is, number one, that question about formulas and formulaic transmission, or technique rather, as a form of transmission. And then what's the difference between the texts that ended up in Spain versus the ones that were created as books in Syria and the Middle East generally?
Both are good questions. The reason why we call them oral with AU is that oral just gives you, just with O, gives you the impression of it's just like I've memorized the text and now you memorize the text. And that gives rise to the need for this formality because otherwise you can't keep it all in your head, right? But what happened here is that I have a copy of the book. You come and you copy it. And then I read it out for you. And then you look at your copy and you correct the mistakes that you've made in copying.
Mistakes I've made
from copying the text, yes. Or, yes. Either you copied it by hand or maybe you bought a copy. You know, maybe you bought a copy from a professional copyist, but you have to hear me, or alternatively, you read it out, and like normally, like when you're more established, right? You're more established scholar, you just, and then the student makes a mistake and you say, oh, no, that was wrong. Correct that. So, but.
Professional copyists, were there anything like scriptoria, monkish scriptoria?
No. So these bookshops sometimes served to that. Yes, yeah. But, so there are individual professionals. So sometimes we have stories of a great scholar gives he has a session where he publishes his book, he reads it out for the first time, and a professional copyist comes and he copies it, so he has the master copy, and then all the students like, oh, can I get a copy, Yes, but he charges exorbitant prices. They go back, complain to the scholar, and says, okay, come back tomorrow, I guess I'll teach it again, and then now you can actually, everyone can write it down. So there is this kind of private market dimension to this, but also students doing it by themselves. That was the first one. Yeah.
The question of the absence of what we had in the West with monasteries and
Yes.
Victoria,
Yes.
where it was the duty, to spend all day.
Yes. No, nothing like this. There are, once you have endowed libraries, you have jobs in the library of somebody who recopies and all, or rebinds, whatever. But there's really no parallel to the monastery. Of course, there are monasteries, the oldest monasteries are in the Middle East, but when I talk about like Arabic Muslim scholarship, of course, monasteries start using Arabic as well. Like they start copying in Arabic at a certain point.
The last part of my question had to do with variance. The farther you got away geographically from the original production, were you seeing variants in Spain that were enormous from the original or not?
So there's a very high velocity of circulation of these books. So you see regional calligraphic styles, but you go to Istanbul, you have a lot of manuscripts that are produced in Morocco. You go to India, a lot of books were produced in Syria or in Egypt, or so like there's an enormous trade volume that was happening. If you read Ibn Battuta, it's a great story to read with students, right? He was this Moroccan traveler in the 14th century, almost contemporary to Marco Polo, but he goes further than Marco Polo goes, and everywhere he goes, there are institutions, like he's Moroccan, he goes to India, he takes up a judgeship. He takes up a judgeship in the Maldive Islands, because there are people like him, right? He goes to China, he finds somebody whose cousin he met in West Africa, because there's so much travel and trade going on that these books, if you look, let's say you say, I want to find this book that was written in Bukhara. You never know where you find it. You might find it in West Africa, right? There's works being rediscovered right now in Timbuktu and sub-Saharan African libraries that we thought were lost 1,000 years ago in Central Asia.
Question from our wings? Want to make sure that we see you?
the last one because we have to move on to the meeting.
There's so many fascinating aspects to this talk. I just thought quickly, literary history, that's not something that I normally think of as a popular topic as opposed to an elite topic. So I'm curious whether there's other genres that might be surprising that you would attribute to this oral tradition. And the other thing is that I would assume that the oral tradition predates significantly the discovery of paper and perhaps writing. And so I was curious how far back you can trace it.
We have pre-Islamic Arabic poetry that was composed pre-Islam and that survived, and we find, for a while it seemed to have circulated primarily orally. We can see that from the variants that have emerged, but again, we find now inscriptions, so people were inscribing stuff pretty early as well. But then at a certain point, it really became like a literary, with scholars writing commentaries and whatever. So it's very deep layers, and it depends on the kind of genre that you are studying. What counts as something that, once you've established a genre, once it's okay to write about this, it becomes established, and you can see at different moments things move over from simply oral transmission to, you find them in libraries, you find them also professionally sold in bookshops. Very often there's complaints that the copies you get in the bookshops, you can barely read them anymore because they've been copied so many times, so many mistakes, and then no proper care for it. So there's kind of philological problems that might be creeping in. But there's an English translation of the Ibn al-Nadim's Fihrist. It's a very bad translation, and it doesn't have all the material. It's like an abridged version, but it can still give you a pretty good idea of what is in there and the variety of things. One of the things, like we have these cookbooks. It was really lovely. It gives you an image of all the kind of plants that spread, like things like sugarcane and rice. These are not plants of antiquity. In antiquity, like the Greeks didn't really, they thought rice was like a medicine you imported from China. Like you can take 10 grains of rice, for that ailment. But it was really like the Muslim empire that took these plants from the tropical, India and China, and bred them so that they would thrive in the Mediterranean region. The Arabic word for sugarcane is qand. And when the Italians started to buy this from the Egyptians, they called it kandi. That's how candy comes about. So these are only later developments that we can already see in these cookbooks they're not just cookbooks, they're of course also medical books, because they show you like you eat this for this and this ailment, and your humors, theory of humors, etc. So sorry, I could talk for hours, but I know there's time limits.
And you will have a chance to do that during our reception, which I invite all of you to stay for in just 30 minutes, but we do want to share some news with you. But before we do that, can you please give it up for Professor El Shamsy? What a wonderful keynote. Thank you.